What is up, internet? Welcome back to the channel. If you watched the last video about working on the interior for the Activan, I mentioned that I was going to make a teardown video of the Honda Beat engine, but I didn't want to do it right now because right now the J13 for the Datsun is currently on my engine stand. I figured since I'm going to be waiting a little bit for parts that I take this engine off of the stand and start to work on the E07A out of the Honda Beat. That's what I'm going to be doing. I got some bolts to mount the engine stand to the engine. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to start taking apart and documenting everything and start organizing everything because I want to know how to put it back together, and that's basically what this video is going to serve as. It's going to be a reference point for me to look back on how the engine's put together, as well as for other people like you. I'm going to take this engine block off of here and then use the hoist and lift up this engine onto the stand. So thanks for watching, and let's get to it. So to start off, I'm going to remove the clutch and the flywheel. The clutch is held on to the flywheel with 6 8mm bolts. So we'll start to take those off. Oh, also, there's this nice little handy little port right here, which has this little rubber mount on it, and there's a little arrow where you can see where I believe top dead center is, because on the top of the flywheel here there's a little marking. So this must be where you're able to tell if it's at top dead center if you're looking at the flywheel, because when it is in the Honda Beat, the timing belt side is pretty hard to get to, so you can't really see where top dead center will be because it's all covered up. So I'm 90% sure that's what it is, so we're gonna go with that. Let's get to taking these bolts out. Now that the clutch is removed, you can see how tiny this thing is. It's about as big as my hand. Usually they are much bigger than this in other Hondas. It's not as bad as I was thinking it was going to be. It's definitely a lot rustier. This engine probably sat for a really long time, and I could probably reuse this clutch, so I'm going to keep this around as an extra. I'm not going to be reusing the clutch. I'm going to just purchase a new one because the ones for the Acti and the Beat are the same, so we'll just drop that in. What I'm going to do to organize myself so I know how to rebuild it after this is I'm going to put the bolts in a bag, label them as the clutch, and then I'm going to put all this stuff together into some plastic bins that I have so that I keep it organized and don't mix any of this stuff up with any other junk that I have laying around. Now that the clutch has been removed, you can see the flywheel, and it is only held on with these 5 14mm bolts. I should be able to get these off, and I don't know if you can tell on the camera, but it looks like this bolt is further away from this bolt than it is this one, so that's so that the flywheel can only go on one way. So there's only one way to put it back on. We will confirm that after we take it off. now all of the 14mm bolts are loosened up. I was just able to get it off with a pry bar and by putting a screwdriver with a bolt in through one of the screws for the bell housing. I was using this guide for the transmission, but it started to dent, so I was kind of worried that I was going to ruin this. I know I can probably replace it, but better be safe than sorry. This is probably really hard to tell on camera, but what I was saying before about some of the bolts being different spacing is that there is only one way to put this flywheel on. You can see that the holes line up right here because this is the proper orientation for the flywheel, but then when you turn it and you try to match up the other holes, this one doesn't match up all the way. And on the back there's a part of the output shaft, I guess, that corresponds with the back of the flywheel, and usually that there's a little hole for like a pin to go in, but there isn't on this one. So there's just a mark right here where this was. There's only one way to put this on, so if you're struggling, just keep spinning it and you'll eventually line it up. Alright, now that the clutch and the flywheel are off, I'll be able to attach the bracket for the engine stand to the engine, and then I will then be able to lift the engine onto the engine stand with my hoist. Bear with me if this is kind of slow paced. I'm trying to take my time and not mess it up, and I'm trying to learn as much as I can about this. So that's why this is like very documentary, because that's what I'm doing. I'm documenting taking it apart so other people don't have as hard of a time taking it apart as I do, hopefully. So let's get through that and keep this train moving. That took a lot longer than it probably should have. It was a little bit of a puzzle to get the bracket for the engine stand on there, because these 4 locations are the only part that are threaded, and I don't have long enough bolts to go all the way through and clamp on the back, so I kind of had to make do with what I have. I think this will be fine. It's not really centered on where the crank is, but I think most of the weight of the engine is over here anyway, so I don't think it'll be that big of a deal. So now I'm gonna get out the hoist, lift it up, and get it onto the stand, and then we'll finally start to be able to take this apart. Alright, all done with getting the engine onto the stand. And it looks pretty great. So now we'll start taking apart some of the accessories. I think the first thing to go is the intake manifold and all of the other stuff attached to it, like the air box, and then going on to the AC compressor, and then the alternator, and then we'll just start working from there. I don't know how far we'll get. I'm gonna truck along until I feel like that is a good amount of content, and we'll pick up where we left off on the next video. So let's start taking some more shit apart. I think I was a little incorrect by calling this the airbox cover because I don't believe this has a filter in it. I may be wrong. Behind this is a piece that connects to the throttle bodies behind here, so I think this is the cover. I am missing a screw right here, but these are just Phillips head screws that I believe are 8mm bolts on top of it, but I'm just going to use my drill real quick and take these out, and then we'll be able to see what's underneath it. Okay, I was incorrect, and then this does have a filter inside, so I guess this is the air box. This filter, like, I don't know if you can see, but there's some oil in here. I'm guessing that comes from the blow-by from the engine, just gets recirculated back into the intake. And here you can see like where that comes into the air box. So I'm going to wipe this down, and so there's only 4 bolts in here that hold the plenum onto the throttle bodies. So I'm gonna do that real quick and go from there. This would be a good point to point out a very specific reassembly note. So the plenum is held on with these really long 12mm bolts, and they just go through here, 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 and here. I just wanted to note that these go all the way through the throttle body into the actual intake manifold, and the plenum, airbox, whatever you want to call it, is also supported with this little bracket underneath, and these are also 12mm bolts. So you'll have to remove this bolt at least to get the actual plenum off of the throttle body. Okay, now that the plenum that attaches to the front of the throttle body is off, you can see that there is like a gasket that goes between here and the plenum. This is the throttle position sensor. I believe this is the idle air control valve, some vacuum lines that go to the fuel rail, and the fuel rail has this awesome piece on it that says M-Trek, which is Honda talk for multiple throttle response electronic control, which is individual throttle bodies. A throttle cable which goes here, and that spins all 3 of the throttle bodies, and then these go to each of the runners into each of the cylinders, and there's 1 fuel injector each, which are here. And I believe I saw somewhere that these fuel injectors are the same that are used on Civics of this time. Don't quote me on it, I will find out, but going to take the idle air control valve off, and then from there I will disconnect some of the wiring, the intake air temperature sensor. I believe this is probably some grounding, I'm not sure. But I need to remember that this part of the harness bolts to the throttle body. Just gonna keep on trucking, disconnect a lot of these sensors, and then hopefully remove the throttle body, the intake manifold, as well as the fuel rail and all that stuff. So we're a little bit closer to having the block stripped down. I just wanted to note something real quick. So a lot of these lines that I was talking about that are vacuum lines, these are either coolant or oil feeds, so they need pressure in order to work the idle air control valve, because that's how it works, and to help keep everything cool. And then also this line at the base of the throttle body right here, it goes down to underneath the distributor. I don't know if you can see it way down there. Okay, after doing some detective work, after removing the throttle body, I found out that most of these ports right here that are connected to the back of the throttle body are for coolant. And as you can see here, this oil gallery is this is sandwiched between the throttle body and the actual intake manifold. So this is the oil going through the idle air control valve, and it comes out right here, and then it circulates back into the engine over here. So this one and this is oil, these are coolant. So just to clear things up, I want to give accurate information, so there we have it. And now we can start to remove the intake manifold and the fuel rail and all the other junk that comes with it. Here is the fuel rail removed, and that little hose that I was struggling to get off right here, which connects to this little kind of 45L down here, is actually the fuel return line, and it comes off of this right here, which is probably some sort of... So I'll have to look up what this exactly is. It does have a vacuum line attached to the top, so I'm sure it has something to do with fuel pressure. It's probably the fuel pressure regulator or sensor, something like that. The fuel rail itself is just held down with these two 10mm bolts right here. You do have to remove two 10mm bolts from the side to get the plastic cover off, and the plastic cover hides the wiring for the fuel injectors. I just wanted to keep it on there for convenience sake. Right now I don't want to disconnect the wiring, so now I'm going to pull out the, I'll just do it now, I'll pull out the fuel injectors and push this all off to the side. I'm going to remove the air intake sensor as well as this kind of weird ground thing, and then I'll be able to unbolt the entire intake manifold from there. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to take off the exhaust manifold and then call it done, because I bet you are sick of seeing time lapses of me taking apart this little Honda engine. So I'm going to get back to it, and I'm going to talk to you at the end of the video. So I'll see you then. Okay, so I finished getting the intake manifold off, and I also pulled out the injectors from the wiring harness, and there's just 3 of them. They have these little clips on here, probably like other similar Honda fuel injectors, but I'm just going to push this to the side, and then I'm going to take the exhaust manifold off, which I believe is held on with some 12mm bolts. You can't really see it. I'm going to have to take this heat shield off first, and then I'm going to call it for a night. But yeah, I'm going to get that done, put you on time lapse real quick, and then close everything out and kind of summarize what we did tonight. So. There you have it. The engine is in the initial stages of getting torn down. The intake manifold and the exhaust manifold are both off. You can see this little tiny exhaust manifold. I don't know if this is stock. It probably is, but this will be of very good use to use as a template for any sort of other manifold that we want to make for it in the future, especially because I would love to turbocharge this engine. So this plate down here will be a great template to make the header flange. I had a little bit of trouble with the bolts for both of the upper and lower heat shields, as well as for the catalytic converter. They were really rusted on there, and then this bracket, which holds up the catalytic converter kind of over here underneath the engine, I only could get one of these bolts out, so I'm going to get this bolt out now that it's accessible, and just going to clean up my mess and then call it quits for the night. Thank you for joining me on the first part of tearing down the Honda Beat E07A. Definitely much more to come in the future on this engine, but that's it for now. Really stoked. I'm excited to learn more about these engines, and it's just fun to tinker on stuff. So thanks again for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for new stuff, and as always, remember, keep it small.